in Gosford, with the new planning scheme, and in fact across the state, there are very few planning provisions for cooperative ownership models. And so what are required is something that provides us some sort of multiple occupancy. And in Gosford, really the only places that allow that are the areas where they are hoping that multi-storey blocks of flats will be built. And so the idea, I think, the assumption is that you'll have a commercial owner who will then rent those flats out. There is a state environmental planning policy for rural land sharing communities, which is really well suited to these sorts of projects. And the problem with them is that they're all in remote areas. It actually started off after the Aquarius Festival in England in the early 70s, where people, after the festival, just bought up a whole lot of cheap land and shifted onto it really without any regard for planning or building regulations at all. And they built their own little shacks, and the government was faced with a choice of saying, well, do we try and kick them off? And they're active academic people with a lot of influence in the cities, and we get a lot of flack, or do we try to make them legal and get them to conform to the building regulations? In fact, in some instances, Byron Shire, for example, there were, being a state planning policy, the Shire can't actually prevent them from occurring, providing the conditions of the state policy are met. But over the last 10 to 15 years, Byron has actually demutualised these co-ops and put subdivisions through that actually mitigate all the cost advantages of being in the co-op, but also cut across a lot of the environmental.
A lovely one to show what happens in the compost bins, which is, I guess the difference, people often wonder what's the difference between composting and worm farming. And the main thing for me is that it's a lot more diversity of things goes into a compost bin. And a worm farm is like a slow and a cold form of composting. So in a compost bin, you can just put food scraps. And you can also, often it might be a bit selective because you have to consider that worms don't like it too acid in there. That's why people say don't put citrus or onion or things in there. It doesn't mean that bacteria and bugs and worms won't eventually eat it, it's just that they make it too sour. So in a compost bin you've got all this diversity of animals and things in there. You can put a whole lot of a mixture of things. You need to put carbon and nitrogen things in. So actually at least double the amount of nitrogen, you need to have double carbon. So if you put a bucket of nitrogen stuff in, which is like rich stuff, like food scraps or green grass clippings, that sort of stuff, or chook poo, that's really high in nitrogen. And if you put a bucket of that in, you want to put at least 2 buckets of woody, dry, brown stuff. So things like sawdust or dead leaves, dried out grass clippings, shredded up cardboard and newspaper, that sort of stuff. And that's what your carbon is. Yeah, the compost is the most fantastic way of reducing all your organic waste and turning it back into a beautiful product that can feed your garden and feed your soil. And that's the main thing that we try and teach. So, let's see, how did people go sorting their food organics? Okay, so we've got the bin labelled like that, but people still get confused about things. Now we have intentionally used these cups because we can compost them. So that's a paper thing. You might end up with a little bit of plasticky, sometimes they've got a wax sticking on the inside, but that's all you'll get left over. But that's not going to get eaten very quickly while it's so dry. So I'd soak it in some water and then put it into a worm farm or the compost bin with all this other stuff. So it gets used up. If you want to tear them up, that will speed it up. Now the smaller things are, the better. So that's, and this one feels very papery. It's a little bit shiny, just to make it waterproof. Have a look. There they all are, look.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of them. So they love that pumpkin and the carrots. So they've really got enough food in here. That's the other thing, you can overfeed. So I won't add any more food in there, but this one obviously needs some feeding at the moment because there's basically some local people come in and put stuff in here, but I don't think they ever pop it in there. So we've got potatoes growing, and you see up this end, this is just mostly worm poop. because the food is always being added up there at the moment.
Oh.
And that is the worm poo that you can use to improve the soil of your garden or to plant things in. You can add a bit of sand or cocoa peat.
This delivered power to the grid for 3 years, and this is in the desert in California, and it was the very first of these designs. Unfortunately, this was destroyed in a war. The war I'm talking about is between the Republicans and the Democrats. George Bush didn't fund this, and just before he ended his second term in office, he had it demolished. So this, for example, is the world's first true baseload solar power station. This delivers power to the grid in Spain today, 24 hours a day, using exactly this technology. And it's not, as you can see, it's not that different to what the US invented in the 1990s. So suddenly the US has jumped back in. They're now building 100 megawatt versions of this, again in the desert in California. So the technology continues.
So the first thing we would do was, if you're on grass, newspaper is great. Newspaper is really good to kill the grass, because you don't want to be using those nasty Roundup. So you put it on nice and thick and overlap it so that so that the grass can't go. So you overlap it by about that much. The grass runners can't get through. And then you build your bed on top. And what we do is put it nice and thick, about 50 to 100 mil thick, 5 to 10 centimetres. And then ample fertiliser, so you can use blood and bone, or this is organic green like lawn food, I think it is, but whatever you can get your hands on. Chicken manure, cow manure is really good as well. You put a fair bit on, because that's going to, all that nitrogen is going to soak into that carbon. And then we can go like some sort of composting. So we put a thin sprinkle of compost. You don't need too much, it's just enough to hold the water in there. And in that compost you've got organisms, bacteria, fungus, and that's the starter culture to start breaking down this raw material. And we do another layer of raw material. Again, you can mix this up, like it could be different things. Like you can start the bottom with sticks and leaves and coarse material, because that's going to, as it sinks down there, you want a bit of air down the bottom, so it's good to have the coarse material on the bottom.
Plant is force fed, it's now going to produce extra leaves, extra branches that needs some fruit. Okay, so be wary. I don't use any nutrient at all, including the compost. Remember what the job of weeds are to grow quick, dry and lay down as mulch, decompose to start to repair the soil, grow again. If I just smother all those weeds with mulch, my mulch begins to break down with those weeds, starts to repair the soil, straight away I have less need for my weeds. Okay. In the beginning, dealing with fairly poor soils, I will actually put a thin layer of worm castings over the top of the soil, pure worm castings, and then I'll lay the mulch over that, because the worm castings have all the microbes in it that I need to initiate the breakdown of the mulch. And I don't add any more worm castings after I initiate. But you could use compost, you could use anything, it's just the worm castings has the highest diversity of microbes of anything else. When I'm talking a thin layer, it's just an inoculant, it's not a fertiliser.
I grew up down at Wooi, down next to the Housing Commission on the other side of the Houso, on the golf course there at the Everglades, and I spent a lot of time down in the swamp studying the animals. When they'd lay their eggs, I used to take down little notes, draw pictures of them, and I used to catch eels. My dad taught me how to nail an eel to a tree and how to skin it and all that sort of stuff, so I was in there being a little bush tucker man, if you can imagine me, just a smaller version. You can eat this type of fungus when it's in season, but when it starts to turn yellow, it'll dye your teeth yellow for good, so you've got to be careful. The women in Central Australia and up in the top end, they dye their hair sort of your colour, mate, but a little bit darker. They mix it with honey and they put it all through the hair and they leave it in for a couple of days, which would certainly have to be pretty uncomfortable. But in a survival situation, if it's freezing cold and you've got to try and curl up, you don't have a blanket or anything, if your clothes are wet, you've got a good chance of getting hypothermia. Lucky I know a bit about bush tucker and bush medicine because I get lost every now and then, and I refuse to call for rescue because a bush tucker man around, you can't get lost in the bush. I'd be really, really embarrassed if that happens. So I'll just, say, well, yeah, I'm actually going to stay here tonight. I'll just camp out here. I'll catch you guys tomorrow. I found a really nice spot. Kariong is a collective term for string-bearing plants. And for anyone that's into botanical names, it's Brachychiton populnus, and there's about 40 different species. Now, if I was to eat that as it is, it would close my throat over and choke me to death. If I was to find Antiantum ethiopicum, which I'd probably find around the edge of the garden, maiden's hair fern, that's a bronchial dilator, so that's the antidote to this, which often growing near the main plant is the antidote growing at the foot. And there would have been Kariong around here back in the day. It's a native plant to this